Good afternoon, Ed. Firstly, I wanted to say what a privilege it is to be able to talk to you about your composition Sky Rhythms for the South Downs Songbook and the opportunity to find out more about the way that you work. And thank you for agreeing to do this. And I'd like to start by just exploring a little bit about your background and the music that's influenced you. So how did you get hooked on music as a child or as a youth? And how did you become a composer?
I was always really interested in reading and creative stuff with words, but I was also somebody who sang in a choir from an early age. And I remember when I was about 5 or 6, I asked my mum on the way to school whether I could have piano lessons. I'm not quite sure where that came from, but it did. So I was lucky, I got piano lessons, which was great. And then I think well into my teenage years, my interest in words, in literature, in reading and writing was really quite dominant. But then I started to realize that music was such an exciting thing, especially when you make music in ensembles. And I remember standing outside the door when the school orchestra were practicing, and I was thinking that would be really, really cool to be in that. I'd love to be a part of that, but I couldn't be because I was playing piano, you see. So at that point, I was probably about 14 or 15. I learned the double bass very quickly, and that got me into the to the orchestra. So that was really exciting. And it was around that sort of time that the various different influences, those kind of early experiences with singing and thinking about music, also trying to sort of hack through music at the piano, like, basically popular music, songbooks, Elvis Presley. I think I had a score to Fame. I just love, sort of sight reading. I did huge amounts of sight reading. But I think from that, and also sort of working my way through hymn books, because I was a chorister. I was singing in a fairly ordinary choir actually, but nevertheless I got to love 4-part harmony because I kept sight reading my way through hymn books and things like that. So a whole kind of mix of strange influences that got me to really love harmony as a primary thing, and also got me to love working and performing in ensembles, and that's really what got me hooked. And I ended up doing A-level music and then taking it on to university as well.
And what are you passionate about musically now?
I really love early music, especially music for voices. So again, that's that thing with text. And I love music which is based on pre-existing chants. So that's like songs, basically. When you have a song that's already exists, you take that tune and you turn it into something new. I find that very inspiring. And that's a very strong feature of English music in the 16th century. So that's one of my more nerdy interests. And then apart from that, I am actually genuinely really interested in contemporary music as well. So I listen to quite a lot of 20th century and contemporary classical music, especially because there's such a range of different styles of musics. And one of the really exciting things about this project is I'm working alongside 3 brilliant professional composers, each of whom have got their very own style. And I love the fact that their view is across experimental, jazz, contemporary, classical. There's quite a reach just within this within this group, which is part of the ethos actually of this project.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So thinking about Sky Rhythms, would you say that this piece is typical of your style?
I wanted to compose a song, so it is typical of my style. I would say it's typical in the sense of the decisions around what we call in music orchestration. In other words, the decisions about musical timbres, when to play a note on a particular instrument, whether it's a flute, guitar, clarinet, bass clarinet, keyboard, piano. All those things are fascinating in the way that you change a note in terms of its emotional quality simply by a decision about how you score it, how you orchestrate it. So I would say that the music is typical of my experience of about 25 years at least of writing music for small mixed chamber ensembles, which is, so I feel I've got some expertise there. So I think it's typical in that sense. But on the other hand, I think it has a kind of openness and transparency quite deliberately. I'm kind of going after that because I wanted to write a song and therefore to include patterns, musical patterns and repetitions that sort of, so it's partly my music, if you see what I mean, but it's partly also working with the idea of the song.
Thank you. Yeah, and we might pick up some of those ideas as we go through it a bit later. But could you set the scene for your piece? You know, what were you wanting to explore or portray in Sky Rhythms?
Yes, well, as you know, the South Downs Songbook brief is to encourage musicians and composers to write songs all about the South Downs and its beautiful natural environment in which, you know, everyone is free to explore and be inspired in. And of course, over hundreds of years, artists of all kinds, visual artists, poets, musicians, songwriters have been inspired to write beautiful things, make objects and make amazing images that respond to this extraordinary, fragile and beautiful natural environment. So that was the, broadly speaking, I was responding to that broad brief. But of course, as a composer, you always want to try and find your own particular way into any project. And I suppose that's what makes it interesting, is that everyone is going to have a different angle. Every single composer, musician who contributes to this songbook is going to have their own angle. And so in my case, I knew about something called the Mass Observation Archive, which is a big archive that resides at Sussex University in the Keep. And this Mass Observation Archive is very fascinating because it has millions of words in it, basically. And all these words are essentially diary entries written by not exactly ordinary people, because they are typically very intelligent people, but not famous people, who simply are talking about a day in their life in a particular year and what they experience. So it's building up a kind of record of people's experiences from the ground up. So I thought it might be quite possible that there were some people who talk about their experience of the South Downs, their experience of the kind of like the beauty of the South Downs. And I was lucky because using the database that the Mass Observation Archive provides, I was able to find an entry going right back to the beginning of the archive in July 1937, written by a woman called Marion Robinson, who at that time was living in a place near Felpham, which is near Bognor Regis, so just on the edge of the South Downs in West Sussex. And she is really fascinating because she comes over as a very intelligent, very engaged kind of person, really intrigued by what this Mass Observation Archive thing is. So she's quite interested to engage with it. And she does this fascinating thing that people seem to do with the diaries, is she talks about her life, her everyday concerns. Then she opens it out to the international situation, reflection on her relationship to the news, which of course, you know, is often quite bleak. But then she does the third thing, which is brilliant. She mentions that she lives close to the South Downs, and it is the view of the South Downs that is so transcendent in her life. And she also mentions that in 1800 to roughly 1803, the artist William Blake also lived in Felpham and was inspired by the skies of the South Downs to create his own images, his own paintings. And her very interesting idea is that it was perhaps the skies, the rhythms of the skies, that influenced some of the visual rhythms in Blake's own work. So that was brilliant from my point of view. So I ended up wanting to kind of create a portrait of Marion on the 12th of July 1937, but also it then sort of opens out into this much broader perspective by quoting William Blake as well.
Thank you. So is that how you normally work? That you look at something that it perhaps isn't musical, but there's just this stimulus, or you do a bit of research to come up with something, so there's some connection with the piece you're going to do, and that's how you would normally work?
Yeah, I think it is in a way. I have written pieces that are, in a sense, abstract. They like speak to pre-existing forms or ways of thinking in music. But I have also been very influenced by a couple of things, actually, both kind of words, texts, the rhythms that you find in texts and words. I love the fact that you can find natural stresses and rhythms and almost like rhythmic motifs in just the words that Marianne Robinson is writing in her text. That was very stimulating. So I like that, but I've also worked with librettos as well. So I've worked with a range of different kinds of texts, and I do find that very stimulating for getting rhythmic structures going in my music, actually. So it's a bit of both. In the past, I have also written music to silent films. And so there is that's a field in which I've created rhythms in response to moving images. So there's a very direct link with the idea of visual rhythms in that respect as well. So although I can't draw at all, I do love visual art and moving images. So the idea of that coming together, music, images, text, environment, into a single piece is quite exciting.
Thank you. So that nicely links into my next question, really, which is about how you normally work and trying to address composer block. Because one of the things I think young composers and children and young people find most difficult is actually getting started with a composition. And you've already hinted at some of the things that you've done there in Sky Rhythms with the rhythm of the words. But how long did it take you to come up with that sort of initial idea or ideas and motifs?
Yeah, I mean,
say anything about getting stuck, that would be useful.
Sure. I mean,
or
I tend to write when things are going well. I tend to write quite quickly. I think you, as a musician, you kind of bring your experience to a project, and the work you do sort of rests on that experience. There's also an element, I suppose you would call research. So in this case, there was something to look at, to delve into, spent, a few days actually exploring the archive and trying to find the right text, and arriving at Marianne Robinson's text was exciting. So kind of getting a feel or a measure for the material and giving yourself time to get your head into the zone, get your head into the actual brief. What is actually being asked of you as a musician, or what kind of parameters are you setting yourself? That feels to me like a really good thing to do, actually, not rush too much. Also, I think it's quite good to, once you get started, I think it's quite good to really kind of like give yourself like an hour or 2 hours to get something done. Even if you don't feel like it, just try and write something. Usually something comes from that. And then also equally, if at the end of that, your first page or two of writing, I do think that it's okay to throw it away as well. If you're not happy with it, you can let it go as well. So don't make yourself miserable by just persisting with something that just isn't coming right. Sometimes, actually, in my experience, I remember writing a piece for a group of 6 players, sextet, and this is some time ago. Yes, quite a long time ago, and towards the early part of my career, my work as a composer for ensembles. And I do remember quite clearly that it felt just not right. Something was not right about the structure. And I had to sit with it for a day or two. And then I realized basically the first 4 pages were rubbish. And then when I threw those away, I was suddenly got to the bit where I'd really got the thing into focus and it was starting to flow. So I think it's a good tip, actually, is just to try and write as much as you can. Be critical, don't be afraid to throw stuff away. Those kind of approaches, I think, are good. Yeah, so persist, basically. If we actually turn to how I got going on this particular piece, yes, the starting point, actually, the text. Okay, so the text was obviously, this is the words of Marion Robinson that I was talking about. And you can see that there is a kind of rhythm. I felt this rhythm as I live in a seaside bungalow town. So I kind of heard, I started to hear an implied rhythm in the words just by, I suppose, just by reading it out to myself. So it started to give me a phrase structure, I suppose, straight away. But the other thing that this page, I suppose, shows is the way in which I did sort of, what's the word, curate the text quite a lot. So I've only chosen a few sentences from her quite extensive response to the Mass Observation Archive for the 12th of July 1937. And obviously I've highlighted the ones that seem kind of quite interesting, basically, where she's kind of getting annoyed with her neighbours. That's one thing. And then noticing what's going on in the world internationally. But then the key kind of turning point is the bit that's sort of marked B2, which is where she starts to talk about, you know, she reveals herself as somebody who's cultured and, you know, is interested in William Blake's paintings and knows about it. That for me is the turning point, and then that lifts it into the quote at the end, which is marked C. That's the William Blake section, which is the piece that the section that finishes the piece. Anyway, just thinking about how did I get started, it did come from the text in this particular case. And so if I like move the slide on to this one, you can see how I was thinking rhythmically, basically, in order to get started. I was thinking rhythmically in response to the patterns of Marion's words.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. So then thinking a little bit larger than that and thinking about form and structure, particularly of this composition, how and when do you go about deciding that? For example, you know, is it right at the start after you've got the key ideas, or during the process? You know, how did it come together, and did it change at all as you developed the composition? Because sometimes I think for children and young people, we're given a structure to work in, or we may select one, but that's not always the way, I think, with composers.
Oh, that's great. So if I go back to my slides again, what I want to show you first is actually the pencil sketch for the opening of the song. And I think you can see that I've sketched out, literally sketched out the harmony, the underlying harmony. The underlying harmony is kind of like an E minor 7 chord for the first 4 bars. It changes slightly with a sort of C-ish feel in the next 4 bars, and then an A minorish feel. So it kind of gradually unfolds, it gradually reveals its sort of harmonic predilections as it goes forward. And I wrote I think I was saying it, this is the funny thing that is hard to explain to people, because you tend to, I think when it's working well, you sometimes write quite quickly. And that's good because it's resting on your long experience, your experience as a musician. So I said earlier, didn't I, that I had this peculiar kind of interest in like hymns because of the, you know, the harmonies, that you very strong harmonies that you get in certain kinds of hymns, but also popular music as well. Very strong harmonies in, I don't know, Elvis Presley or all sorts of different bits and pieces of 20th century popular music, which you could get in the form of sheet music, basically, which I used to buy at my local music shop. So that's how I sort of got to know chords through the keyboard. Probably most people would learn those chords through guitar, but for me it was through keyboard and sight reading on the piano. So what I'm saying is that the structure came pretty quickly with the tune, with the evolution of the tune, the main tune for Sky Rhythms, which is this one. And so what you've got here is a 32 bar kind of structure, opening section of the piece. And because it's a song, this structure occurs 2 or 3 times, but I vary it. So I'm always interested in musical contrast. And so the tempo of Sky Rhythms is fairly quick, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's going along at a reasonable speed. So I also wanted to have some contrast. And what I mean by contrast is some sections of harmony where it's both more static, it stays in the same zone, but also a bit more chromatic as well, which means it uses notes from outside the normal scale slightly. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is because I wanted to experiment a bit with timbre. And so if you keep the harmony fairly static for a while, then it's easier to experiment with timbral change. The other thing is that, and I'm still at the stage, to be honest with you, because at the time of our speaking, the first performance hasn't actually happened yet. So what I'm hoping is that we will also be able to integrate some delays, that's right, pedal effects on possibly two of the instruments. One is the electric guitar and the other is the clarinet. And if that's possible, I sense that that's going to work more effectively in passages where the harmony is relatively static. So this is like the structure basically of the whole piece. So where it says A1, that's what I've just shown you in pencil sketch. And then the kind of pattern is repeated. So hopefully people will sense that although this is kind of slightly weird classical music, at the same time it does have a relationship to patterns of music that you might know if you're into songwriting. And then this B section is where you get the change, the contrast. You basically have the music flowing over a bass, a ground, a kind of pedal, basically, a drone, if you like. And that's where I'm expecting, well, I'm hoping that we'll be able to try out some sort of special effects with the instruments. So the only other thing to say about that is, so I suppose what you'd say about the structure is that, broadly speaking, really broadly, you have an A type material and you have B type material. But then you also have the final bit, which is completely in a kind of another world, another space, the space of 1800, William Blake's vision of heaven over the South Downs. And for that, I save up going into a kind of modal, major modal type feel. And it isn't a folk song. Funnily enough, I originally thought that we would all be working with folk songs when I started this project, but it turns out that I don't think any of us are actually going to be directly working with folk songs. But because I've been quite immersed in folk songs, I wanted to create something that hints at that kind of world as we get to Blake's kind of extraordinary vision towards the end of the song. So that's I suppose that's how I would describe the structure of the piece.
Thank you. That's really useful. And actually, by those slides show that perhaps you think maybe in terms of manuscript paper visually, but also in terms of blocks. And I know I've heard some young composers talking about how they visualize things like Lego blocks in different colors and different sizes and things to get a structure. And I think possibly guitarists as well think like that. So it's interesting to hear you share those different ways of presenting, if you like, the structure of the piece, which I think is really useful. And are there any opportunities in this piece that you think for technology to be used, or that young composers could take things out to use in something like Ableton or
yes,
or whatever?
Yeah, I think that would be worth looking at, and I'm actually looking at going back to my my manuscript and looking at the sections, and I think one thing that could be possible is to take the underlying harmonies actually and turn them into a MIDI file, which could then be used maybe as part of the background of someone else's song. So that would certainly be possible.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I find also in your piece that the use of space is really interesting. It's something I think that young composers often struggle with, as the temptation is you've got 6 or 7 instruments, you want to write from them pretty well most of the time, but your piece here doesn't do that.
I'm so glad you said that, Duncan. That's the best thing anyone's ever said to me, because I'm like, the normal feedback I get is, yeah, it's great, Ed, but aren't you writing too many notes for too many instruments all the time? Yeah, for me, actually, I think maybe this, you know, it's only a 5-minute piece. It's, the whole thing is kind of actually a pilot project. We wanted to do something experimental. We wanted to learn from each other's very different styles and interests. We wanted to try and mix up a classical ensemble, like what used to be called a Pierrot ensemble after Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire, which is of course singer, flute, clarinet, violin, cello and piano. Instead, we've got an ensemble of singer, flute, doubling piccolo, clarinet, doubling bass clarinet, electric guitar, keyboard and cello. So we don't have a violin in this particular lineup in order to let the electric guitar in. So I think that's really fun and experimental, but at the same time, you know, it is an experiment. Anyway, thank you for your comment, because that does mean a lot. And I think the reason why this is possible is partly because there's a sort of openness about the project, which is we are doing songs, and so it's okay to keep the harmony relatively simple. It's okay to work with patterns and repetition, and for me that's quite helpful, because it means that, yeah, I could just write for 2 instruments, or I could have an arpeggio that just floats up through all of the instruments, and that actually, that's quite liberating, actually. And one thing I realize, just, you know, how composition processes sort of unfold or reveal themselves to you almost as you write when it's going well. I realized just towards the end, I wanted to have hardly any scoring other than the voice and the piano, or the voice and the keyboard, depending on how it's performed, right at the end. Because again, that gives another kind of like space, as you said, a kind of emotional space, as it were, signaled through actually reducing the orchestration towards the close.
Thank you. And are there any particular techniques that you've used in your piece, perhaps for a specific instrument or something that might benefit from an explanation? I mean, I'm thinking a letter B in your score. I know you've got a piano motive that goes 4 notes, which goes up to 5 notes, which goes up to 6 notes, which could convey a sort of sense of unease, I felt, possibly. And I wondered if that was intended to do so, or whether there are any, the vocal lines in the piece are quite different in different sections of the piece. And often when songs, we find it quite, it's sort of quite cohesive in terms of it tends to be quite similar. And this isn't, it's got very different lines. And I just wondered if there's anything you wanted to say about any of those or other techniques and things that you'd used.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point about letter B and the way in which the piano is working. And for me, that relates to what sort of relates to what I was saying earlier, which is that the B section is when you have the harmony go quite static, and it feels like if you harmony that changes, and you know, where you have harmonic chords changing, is very powerful, and I love it. I love changing harmonies. But also, you can also benefit from different kinds of compositional opportunities when you still the harmonic change, and you can just focus on the linear a lot more, and that's what's happening at this point in time. So just by having a bass, you know, a bass, yeah, it's kind of grounded in C essentially. That enables you to kind of explore what might be called a sort of a mini note row. It's perhaps note row isn't quite the right way of putting it. It's sort of like a note collection, and because of if you then basically work with the repeating note collection, and that F sharp, which is kind of quite a not bluesy, E flat F sharp against C, is kind of, there's tension in there which is unresolved, and as it goes on to different, like onto the beat and then off on the offbeat, it creates a certain kind of emotional character which I enjoyed working with, and that's matched by the scoring, the more spare scoring for a trio of bass, clarinet, electric guitar and keyboard. So I like the idea that that it's like a window where you can explore a different sound world, which can be quite obsessive. Yeah, so so I think you're right, actually. That's a really helpful insight, actually. Thanks, because in other areas you have more sense of like harmonic flow and a more diatonic, you know, using regular notes of the regular scale to make the melodies and the harmonies. So I think that's a, yeah, that's a kind of characteristic aspect of contrast which almost drives the piece.
Yes, and you've got quite a few sort of, well, quite a few short motifs, haven't you, that appear quite a lot, and they're almost, it feels or sounds a little bit minimalist, some of the influences at times, and I think maybe that gives that sense of, you know, relentless momentum provided by the electric guitar and the semi-quaver motifs from the piano, the flute, and the clarinet, and then that juxtaposition of the rhythmically simple vocal line at times. There's a lot going on, and I don't know whether there's anything you want to talk about particularly there, but there's a lot to explore.
I think motifs are good when they're short. And in fact, they can have more character when they're quite short. And of course, if you study like Wagner, who wrote 3-hour, you know, epic operas, basically, you know that the motifs typically quite short. And one of the brilliant things about that is that they can then transpose themselves and be very flexible. And so they become like, if you think about it, like painters like Miro, or painters that use fine points of color and tiny motifs, that doesn't stop you from creating a really big canvas. So
yeah, pointillism.
that one, yeah. yeah, absolutely. No, endless source of inspiration, early 20th century visual art, I think, absolutely. So yes, I can't remember, have I answered the question?
Yes, yes, talking about different devices, but we've covered a lot. I think I was just moving on towards the ending of pieces. I think that's something that young composers struggle with, as well as the start. It's how do they finish, and your ending, as you've already mentioned, is quite sudden and unexpected in some ways. And you've already sort of explained about why you've done that. But did you always have that idea, or did you have, or is that one of your trademarks, you know, having an unusual ending that's unexpected?
I think I've got better at endings over the years, to be honest with you, because I think I've become more confident just because of, again, it's practicing working with harmony and orchestration and rhythms and ideas, and also having that sense of, it's almost like, I sometimes think it is like going for a walk, and you know, you've got periods of ascent and then you've got periods of return, and having the measure of that and having the confidence to stay with the walk is an important thing in terms of the craft, I suppose, of composition. I agree it's unexpected, but at the same time, I think it works in the sense that emotionally it's unexpected, but also emotionally it's a sort of a form of closure, but also with a massive load of question marks at the end as well. Yeah. What on earth is William Blake going on about? You know, what does it symbolize? I mean, the way I suppose what I'm trying to say is that somehow through Marianne Robinson writing about her life on the 12th of July 1937, invoking William Blake, I suppose I'm sort of imagining a moment where suddenly William Blake speaks through the situation and almost like, yeah, directly to the audience. I think that's where I was going with it. But I wanted to create something that was both, what's the word, took us to an inspiring vision, an optimistic vision. The international context in 1937 was as bleak as it is now, if not more so, and yet there is this sense of need for hope and need for transfiguration, which one can attain through, I suppose, appreciation of nature.
So your ending also came about because of the research you did, and because of it's lyrics, isn't it? Really, it's the words that have pushed the direction of how the piece would end. So I guess what I'm saying is, for young composers, that it's about what do you want to say in your piece will determine, possibly to a certain extent, what type of ending you have. But have courage to end in unexpected ways if it works.
I think that's absolutely brilliant summary. Work out what you want to say in your piece, own the piece. So if you are writing a piece for the South Downs Songbook, that's great, and we know that we've given a brief and we're asking you to follow a brief, but there also needs to come a point where you invest in the piece and own it. So whether you're doing it for GCSE, A-level, undergraduate, postgraduate, professional, beyond, you quite often as a composer are asked to meet a brief, but then the really good bit is when you actually take it over and own it and invest yourself in it, and you know what you're going to say. And yes, you're right. For me, I was just really interested in the just stumbling across this text in the Mass Observation Archive and thinking about both what it said about the environment of the South Downs, but also about the human relationship to that, and also to, I suppose, to international affairs as well.